This ground that I'm walking on right now, it used to be covered by water. And as lake levels are expected to continue to drop here at Lake Mead, the gap between where the water was and where it is.
Walk down to the shoreline at Lake Mead today, and you are not walking along a lake. You are walking through a museum of everything the desert swallowed and is now handing back. A bathtub ring of bleached mineral deposits runs along the canyon walls, marking a waterline that has not been touched in years. Below it, boat hulls from the Reagan era sit cracked open in the sun. Concrete intake towers that were built to sit deep underwater now stand fully exposed, their ladders leading down to nothing. And scattered across the newly dried mud are rusted metal drums, some of them empty, some of them not, pulled from ground that was 60 feet underwater a few short years ago. This is the largest reservoir in the United States, and it is currently sitting at roughly a quarter of its capacity, closer to its record low than most people realize. What is surfacing along its shrinking edge is not just old junk. It is the physical proof of a promise the American Southwest made to itself over a century ago, a promise the desert was never actually able to keep. To understand why the ground at Lake Mead is doing this, you have to go back almost exactly 100 years to a lodge in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a negotiation that was less about water and more about preventing an actual war between American states. In November of 1922, delegates from 7 western states gathered at Bishop's Lodge outside Santa Fe to hammer out what became known as the Colorado River Compact. The men in that room represented Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico in what would become the Upper Basin, and California, Arizona, and Nevada in the Lower Basin. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, ran the negotiations. This was not an academic exercise. California had already been diverting huge volumes of Colorado River water into the Imperial Valley, and Arizona's leadership had grown furious enough about it that the state seriously considered using force to stop California's canal construction. The federal government stepped in specifically to keep that conflict from turning physical. The solution the negotiators landed on was to split the river's water between the two basins, roughly 7.5 million acre-feet each, with extra allotments carved out for Mexico and future growth. It sounded clean and fair on paper. The problem was the paper itself. Engineers calculated the river's available flow using stream gauge records from roughly 1905 through the early 1920s, and they arrived at an average of around 17 million acre-feet a year. That number became the foundation for the entire agreement. Decades later, when scientists began reconstructing the Colorado River's flow using tree ring data, a far less comfortable picture emerged. Long-lived conifers across the basin, some of them centuries old, lay down growth rings that widen in wet years and narrow in dry ones, giving hydrologists a way to estimate river flow going back roughly 1,000 years or more. Researchers working out of dendrochronology labs in the Southwest have spent decades coring trees, cross-referencing ring widths against known flood and drought years, and stitching together a reconstruction of the river's behavior that extends back well before European settlement of the continent. What that record shows is that the early 20th century, the exact stretch of years the compact's negotiators used as their baseline, was an unusually wet period in the river's long history. The true long-term average flow appears to be well below what the 1922 engineers assumed, likely somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 to 15 million acre-feet in an average year, not 17. Some engineers in the room at Bishop's Lodge actually raised doubts at the time about whether the measurement period was representative. Those doubts did not carry the day. The states wanted certainty, the federal government wanted peace between them, and the deal got signed. It is worth sitting with how large that gap actually is. A shortfall of 3 to 4 million acre-feet a year does not sound dramatic until you convert it into something tangible. 1 acre-foot is roughly enough water to cover a football field a foot deep, or to supply an average American household for the better part of a year. A gap of that size, compounding year after year, is not a rounding error in anyone's spreadsheet. It is the difference between a system that balances and a system that has been quietly borrowing against a debt it never planned to repay. For most of the 20th century, nobody had to reckon with that debt directly because the reservoirs downstream were deep enough to make the shortfall invisible. For a long time, this discrepancy simply did not matter because the system had a shock absorber. Hoover Dam was finished in 1936, one of the signature engineering achievements of the Depression era, and Lake Mead began filling behind it. For much of the 20th century, the imbalance between what the compact promised and what the river actually delivered got quietly buffered by the reservoir itself. Wet years padded the account. Dry years drew it down. Cities kept growing. Farms kept expanding. The lake reached its historic high point in 1983, filled almost to the brim, water lapping at elevations that today sit well over 150 feet above where the surface currently stands. That buffer only works if the deposits eventually get topped back up. Starting around 2000, the Colorado River Basin entered a stretch of dry years that hydrologists first described using a word that implies an ending: drought. Snowpack in the Rockies, which feeds the vast majority of the river's flow, began arriving lighter and melting earlier. Lake Mead's level slid down through one benchmark after another. By 2021, it had fallen far enough to trigger the first official shortage declaration on the river, forcing mandatory cuts to Arizona and Nevada. Further cuts followed in 2022, and somewhere in that stretch of falling numbers, federal water officials began quietly retiring the word drought in favor of a much colder one: aridification. The distinction matters enormously. A drought implies a temporary departure from normal, something that eventually snaps back once the rain returns. Aridification describes something else entirely: a permanent shift in the baseline climate of a region. Under that framing, the wet decades the 1922 compact was built on were not a dip below normal that the basin would eventually recover to. They were the anomaly. The drier conditions the Southwest is settling into now may simply be what normal actually looks like for this stretch of the continent, and there is no guarantee the system ever returns to the abundance it briefly enjoyed a century ago. As of this summer, Lake Mead's surface elevation sits at roughly 1,041 feet, which works out to just under a quarter of the reservoir's total capacity and puts the lake within a few feet of the record low it set back in the summer of 2022. Full pool, for reference, sits at 1,229 feet, meaning the lake is currently sitting nearly 190 feet below where it can theoretically fill. Inflows this water year have run well under half of the historical average, and the current snowpack that feeds the system arrived thin. Two elevation numbers matter more than any others once you get this deep into shortage territory, and both of them live inside Hoover Dam's own engineering schematics. The first sits at roughly 950 feet, the point where the dam's hydroelectric turbines start losing efficiency as water pressure drops and the risk of cavitation damage to the machinery increases. Below that line, the dam's ability to generate power for the roughly 1.5 million homes and businesses it serves across Nevada, Arizona, and California starts to erode. The second number is the one nobody in the water business says casually: 895 feet. That is Deadpool. The elevation at which the lake drops below Hoover Dam's lowest outlet works entirely. Below Deadpool, water simply cannot flow through the dam by gravity anymore. No releases downstream. No power generation. The Colorado River would keep pouring into the lake. It just would not be able to leave it. Right now, Lake Mead sits roughly 145 feet above that Deadpool threshold and about 90 feet above the power generation threshold. That sounds like breathing room, and compared to a genuine worst-case emergency, it is. But water managers have watched the lake shed double-digit feet of elevation in the span of a single bad year before, driven by a combination of low snowpack, high temperatures, and roughly 600,000 acre-feet lost to evaporation off the reservoir's own surface every year. Water that disappears in a desert air without ever reaching a single tap or field. The margin is real, but it is not the kind of margin anyone downstream is comfortable calling permanent. The retreat is also reshaping the lake's own economy in real time. Marinas that once floated on deep water have had to relocate their docks further and further out, sometimes multiple times in a single decade, chasing a shoreline that keeps moving away from them. Boat ramps that were functional a few summers ago now end in dry gravel well short of the water. National Park Service crews have spent years extending access roads and repositioning launch points just to keep recreational boating viable at all. An expensive, ongoing chase against a lake that is not cooperating. Houseboat rental companies that anchored Lake Mead's tourism economy for generations have had to adapt their entire business model around a reservoir that behaves less like a stable lake and more like a slowly draining bathtub. None of that is the headline story, but it is the everyday texture of what a falling reservoir actually does to the communities built around its edge. Of the major cities tied to this system, Las Vegas moved earliest and most aggressively to protect itself, largely because it has the most to lose relative to its size. The city draws roughly 90% of its water supply from Lake Mead, which means a genuine Deadpool scenario is not an abstract inconvenience for southern Nevada. It is existential. In the early 2000s, as the decline first became apparent, engineers at the Southern Nevada Water Authority ran the numbers on the city's original water intake infrastructure and did not love what they found. Those intakes were built assuming a mostly full reservoir. As the lake kept dropping, the risk was not that the water would run out entirely, but that the intake pipes themselves would end up sitting above the waterline, unable to draw water that was technically still there. The response was a tunnel boring project locals nicknamed the Third Straw, a new intake structure engineered to sit low enough to keep drawing water from Lake Mead even if the reservoir eventually falls all the way to Deadpool. Construction ran from roughly 2008 to 2015, involved boring through underwater rock at depths that pushed the limits of what tunneling crews could safely manage, and carried a price tag north of $1 billion. The fact that a major American city spent that kind of money and that kind of engineering risk building an intake specifically designed to survive a scenario federal officials were not yet describing publicly is likely tells you something about how seriously the people closest to the gauge readings were taking the trend line. Not every city downstream has the option of simply digging deeper. Phoenix draws a large share of its water through the Central Arizona Project, a canal system stretching more than 300 miles from the river near Lake Havasu across the desert to central Arizona, one of the most expensive pieces of water infrastructure ever built in the country. The vulnerability here is not engineering, it is seniority. Arizona was the last of the 7 compact states to formally ratify the agreement, holding out for years while California claimed a larger share of the river's flow. When Arizona finally signed on, it did so in exchange for federal funding to build the Central Arizona